Well, thanks for your participation in the meeting today. I think it's been a fantastic meeting, at least for my own personal learning. You know, what we had hoped to do, the cancer support community and our partnering organizations, was to level set everyone around just basic information about the FDA. How do they work? Where do they sit? Who do they speak with? How do they interact with Congress? Just really those nuts and bolts points so that we can think about our own agendas and how to move those forward, whether it's in collaboration with each other, whether it's in collaboration with the agency, etc. So when we were talking about this agenda today, we thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great that after we've sort of level set everything and really mapped out ways in which you can productively work with the FDA, that we bring two real examples of organizations who have effectively worked with the FDA to advance causes related to their particular diseases. And so hands down, the two names that rose to the top immediately were the two that are sitting in front of you today. So what I'd like to do for this next session, if you don't mind, is, Pat, I'm going to start with you. And if you could just share with this group what it is that you've done to work with the FDA and how that's really advanced the cause of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And then, Jeff, I'm going to turn to you and ask for the same thing. Sort of walk us through what those steps were, what were key pivot points, et cetera, in that process.
Sure. So just to set the stage so you know what Duchenne muscular dystrophy is. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked pediatric neuromuscular disease. It affects primarily boys because it's X-linked. So they're diagnosed between the ages of 4 and 6 years old. It follows a very specific and predictive course in terms of these young boys look normal at birth. They achieve their milestones, although often delayed. They plateau at about, depends on the age, 9 to 11 years old, at which time the growth is slowed down, so the muscle degeneration becomes more apparent, and boys lose function. So they're off their feet, can't walk anymore by 10 to 12. Their arms are incredibly weak, so they can't feed themselves by about the age of 15 or 16. They use non-invasive ventilation because when they're laying down at night, the diaphragm doesn't work very well, so they can't really release the CO2. So they need ventilation often as they're late teenage stage. They need ventilation during the day as well, and the mean age of death is in the late 20s. So it's a pretty horrible, devastating disease, as each of those loss of functions you might feel pretty much like a little death, right? So I've been working in this space for 30 years. My two boys had Duchenne. They were diagnosed in 1984. They died at 15 and 17 following that very progressive course. We came to Washington, found some champions in both the House and Senate. In 2001, a bill was introduced called the MD Care Act. That bill was signed into law in 2001, called the MD Care Act, reauthorized in 2008, and again, the amendments in 2014. So that bill, and I'm saying this to set the stage for what has happened in Duchenne, that piece of legislation and the NIH responsible institutes, NIAMS, NINDS, NICHD, responded by investing in Duchenne, as did the Center for Disease Control. And so that really galvanized the field. Next to the cloning of the gene, I think that MD Care Act legislation galvanized a field of research that we felt needed and deserved work, not just Duchenne, but the whole neuromuscular field, which is about 9 categories of diseases and 100 variations or more underneath all of those. So that kind of brings us forward to where are we in the last years? Well, the interesting thing is because it galvanized the field, we had industry coming, not only to look at the protein that's missing in this disease, but replacing it, and then looking at the downstream pathology, which includes antifibrotics, building muscle with anti-myostatin, increasing circulation, improving the mitochondrial function. So all of these wonderful things. So we had this growing group of companies that were interested in this space, in addition to the fact that we had a clinical trial that was terminated because they got the dose wrong. And this was about in 2009. So we started meeting with the FDA. We went to see the division Cedar Neurology. We wrote a lovely letter and said, we'd like to just sit down with you. We don't want to talk about a particular drug. We want to talk about Duchenne, because while we understand that you have to know about these diseases, we know more because we live with them. So it's different living with than it is looking at something from its physiology, for instance. So we had these very interesting meetings about unmet need, and that started our relationship with Cedar Neurology. And along there, we decided that you know, these new tools that have been in use in legislation or coming into legislation, such as accelerated approval, breakthrough designation of the last PDUFA, we felt that those were fantastic tools. And we looked in Europe as conditional approval and thought that's also a fantastic tool. Not received very well here, but nevertheless, we believe that it was a terrific tool. So we wanted to look at how does Duchenne fit into those policies, as well as the PCAST report. So we wrote a white paper with a lot of people, some from the cancer field, and basically looked at Duchenne in the context of policy and made recommendations. We recommend the use of accelerated approval. We ask for guidance on surrogates so that we're very clear on what's required. We recommend the use of conditional approval. I wasn't resoundingly thrilled by the CDER neurology, but we did it anyway. And then the fourth was to really understand this unmet need and to understand that the benefit-risk equation is different in this disease than perhaps other diseases you're familiar with. So that led to another meeting with CDER Neurology when we discussed the paper, and as I mentioned, conditional approval wasn't a thrilling recommendation for them. But we said this benefit-risk equation is far different in our disease. We take risks by the very prognosis we're carrying for our children, and they have risks. And then they're on chronic steroids. And so the risks, some are known and some are unknown, but we're willing to take on risk for benefit. So in the middle of this meeting, we talked about the fact that coming and telling our story is reasonable and valid, but the FDA works on data. So how is it that we capture and quantify, for instance, tears, right? The tears of this community and the equation of benefit-risk. So we then embarked on a benefit-risk survey. So we enlisted the aid of Johns Hopkins, specifically John Bridges at Hopkins. We had an internal social scientist, her name is Holly P.A., and I said to them, we want to pilot. I want to explore this equation of benefit-risk in a very rigorous, systematic way so that we can present the data to the FDA. We did that inside of 6 months. We conducted a survey of caregivers and examined their preferences. I had a hypothesis because when my boys were here, I borrowed $100,000 a day of their diagnosis and ran around the world to see if I could cure them because I wanted to buy time for them. I wanted to buy quality time. So my answer to somebody saying, what are you looking for, is 5 minutes, right? So we quantified that and we demonstrated to the FDA in a rigorous way that the caregiver preference in this context, 119 caregivers, we had all the statistics on those caregivers, we recruited them through social networks. The highest priority was for slowing or halting progression of this illness. That was the highest priority. The very least priority for them was themselves. Those parents didn't care about their health, they didn't care about doing anything in terms of fun or spare time without their son. Highest priority was slowing or stopping progression. That was rated much higher than more years of life. So quality over survival. So that led to another meeting with CDER Neurology, and we said, here's the data, and we want to know, is this what you're looking for? Is this sufficiently rigorous for you? What else do you need to know? So the response there was, it is rigorous, we accept this is very good information. However, we'd like to know if this equation is the same or different in the adolescents and young adults with a disease, and we'd like to know if this equation changes over the trajectory of the illness. Do you take on more risk as a little one? Do you take on more risk as somebody who's lost considerable function? So we're in the middle, or I should say, we're at the beginning with John Bridges again, expanding our benefit risk. That led us to a further discussion because the EMA released guidance on Duchenne. When they released guidance on Duchenne for the very reason that so many companies were working in this space, we took a look at the guidance and said, we don't like it. So we wrote a letter to the EMA. We had a meeting over there with the EMA and described exactly the places that we felt you have totally avoided or ignored or failed to include the patient voice. So that led us to the next visit with CDER Neurology, said, here's the guidance from EMA. We don't like it, but we're happy to write different guidance with you. So we're happy to be your voice. Let's partner on this. And Dr. Woodcock said to me, why don't you write guidance? So you know how sometimes something comes out of your mouth and then you walk out the door and think, oh, okay. Well, when I walked out the door, the first thing I thought was, why did that slip out of your mouth? And the second thing I thought is, who better to write guidance for the FDA than the community that's affected by it? So we reached out to the HIV community because these are very smart, aggressive people who want efficient, safe medicine or effective, safe medicines, we enlisted the aid of the AMFAR folks, the ACT UP groups, and we enlisted a science writer, we got a project manager, and we then went back to the FDA and said we'd like to hold a policy forum to discuss with you and this community some of the issues that are relevant, perhaps controversial, and maybe even conflicting. We had a policy forum in December of 2013. There were 250 of our families with us and 19 members of the FDA present. We discussed natural history, outcome measures, dystrophin as a surrogate, or dystrophin, how we measure it, what methodologies are used around measuring it, how we can interpret it, and then we wanted to discuss extrapolation because in our community, most of the trials are an ambulatory population, and our population is pretty broad, most of them not ambulatory. So we had this policy forum. Then on January the 5th, we began with our steering committee, which was representative of patients, industry, as well as academia. They were each assigned a working group from benefit risks, diagnosis, natural history, outcome measures, novel trial design, and the patient voice. Each steering committee member was responsible to lead a working group consisting of 10 to 12 people with equal representation of industry, academia, and patients. We, within 6 months, created draft guidance. It was a 42-page document, well-referenced. Our rules around that were nothing could be in that document that was not published, so we couldn't have anecdotal reports of some academic who found something. It was all very serious. We submitted it to the open docket. It was open on the FDA website until October the 6th for open public comment, and I'm happy to say that the FDA used that as a platform, and in June of this year released their own guidance on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We felt that this was an example of an extraordinary partnership with the FDA and an extraordinary way to raise our voice and educate them and they us about what their struggles are, what our struggles were, and we have engaged the entire community within this process with a community advisory board who reviewed all 45 iterations of this document along the way and commented so that we could deliver a robust document. The cover letter was the patient voice that said, we want faster trials, less people involved if possible, novel designs that include everyone in the spectrum of this illness. We want less exposure to placebo, and we want to be your partner so that you understand what living with this disease means and is. And I think just to sort of follow on to that, we have now been in discussion with them about the cardiac implications of this disease. Most boys die of heart failure. We then went to HLBI. We convened a meeting with HLBI. We sponsored the meeting. And now we are in active discussions with working groups on cardiac outcome measures that the FDA is considering would be useful as a primary outcome measure in a disease that's targeted to the Duchenne heart. And in February of this year, we will hold a pulmonary outcomes meeting for the same reason, to look at what are the pulmonary outcomes if we really drive a therapy and to look specifically at respiratory effort. So that's been our story, and that's a continuing story, and they've been open and receptive, and we work with Steve and all of these departments to have webinars to inform our patients along the way of here's where we are, here's what we've learned, and then we pull them in. We're going into 2 AdCom meetings, and we recently had a wonderful webinar about what is an AdCom, what's expected, what can you do as a person to participate, how can we gather your voice collectively so that the FDA understands that this is community speak as opposed to one loud voice, and this is about a disease that affects many. And so that's how we intervene, and that's our story.
So do you like the FDA guidance?
I like the FDA guidance. You know, we were all uniformly impressed when, and I think I can say to you, they had an open public comment period, so I don't know of all the comments. I know of some, but in general, the community was incredibly pleased. First of all, that we together were able to craft such a document. I think for our disease, it was a journey through our disease. You know, because as a mom with 2 boys, when they were diagnosed, I kind of said, well, how hard is this? How hard can it be, right? Who's all hiding the cure or whatever? And I learned over 30 years that it's pretty hard. There's lots of things to do, money, policy, lots of things to do. So that was an education, and I think crafting guidance really informed our community, because people will say, you know, dystrophin should be a surrogate. And then during the discussion of the working group about what methodology, how do you know? Are the associated proteins all reconfigured? Is it localized at the sarcolemma? And these parents were like, oh, you know, it's not simple. And is it uniform across every muscle? So I think this was an education for our whole community. And also the feeling that there's an FDA that wants to learn and listen. And they will do that with good partners in a good partnership, and they will further learn about the heart and the pulmonary measures and work with you. I think it reassured our community that we have an FDA that really wants to do the best for us possible. And that's led to a certainly greater advocacy in terms of 21st century cures, a greater dialogue with our community. It's been a very rich experience, and we've been thankful for the response on the guidance. It's been terrific. Now approvals.
So one of the things you mentioned were tools that you had available for accelerated approvals, fast track, et cetera, right? I know that you know this, but the gentleman to your left had a lot to do with some of that work. And so, Jeff, we'd love for you, we owe a great deal of gratitude for the work that you've done quietly and silently alongside of the FDA and others. And would love for you to share with this audience and those who will watch this film later some of the things that you did and how did you do it and the steps that you took.
Sure. You know, I think our experience over many years working with the agency, you know, hearing Pat tell her story, it's not all that dissimilar. You know, there are a few key phrases that are important ones that, you know, that she mentioned as well. Things like relationship, bringing stakeholders together, data. You know, these are all important things. Because, you know, FDA is a scientific organization, and sometimes that is difficult to engage with because a lot of the issues that advocacy organizations are dealing with are oftentimes anecdotal or emotional, you know, appropriately, but how to effectively translate that into data that all of these different, you know, approaches to achieving the same goal can coincide. I think that having been in this field for a number of years, I've seen things change in terms of working with the FDA. You know, a decade or more ago, I think there was a little bit more of a lack of knowledge as to what the FDA even did, which created a little bit of hostility. You know, people knew that, you know, they were the regulator, and that seemed like a threatening, negative position to be in. And so I think a lot of people kind of took the position of, I know I'm not supposed to like this agency, but I'm not sure why. You know, but I think that's changed in many ways because the FDA has been able to get out there more and talk about what they're doing and be involved in some of these discussions very actively because, you know, these are subject matter experts and, you know, people who go to work at this agency to protect and promote the health of the public. You know, they're not there because they are interested in, you know, ruling with an iron fist, so to speak. So over the years, I think we've developed a collaborative relationship with the agency by being as data-driven as possible and trying to be as tangible as we can in identifying mutual challenges. And in terms of the breakthrough therapy designation that you mentioned, you know, when we started working on this topic with FDA, it was really to try and gain multi-stakeholder opinions and expert opinions about a challenge that everyone in the field of oncology was facing. And it wasn't to address a problem at FDA, it wasn't to address a problem within the industry or a problem in academia. This was a problem in oncology, and frankly, it was almost a good problem to have. So we do a series of workshops throughout the year that are built around bringing these multiple stakeholders together from different sectors in order to try and propose solutions to a pre-identified problem. So in the case of the breakthrough therapy designation, we had no intention of seeking legislation, quite frankly, when this began. It was really, in speaking with FDA leadership, we had agreed that we are starting to see with greater frequency a phenomena in oncology drug development and in some other disease settings as well. So this wasn't meant to be cancer specific, but we did ultimately use oncology as a case study, so to speak. But the question that we were looking to answer was, when you see a really unprecedented treatment effect very early on in development, in phase 1 or early phase 2, what steps should be taken to do business differently? And this was fueled in many ways by a melanoma drug that received a great deal of attention as the sponsor was going through the process of developing the drug. And the New York Times picked up the story in 2010 about how 2 cousins were involved in a clinical trial for this drug. One was randomized to the standard of care control arm, and the other to this new drug. Well, at that time in melanoma, the standard of care was effectively an ineffective option. But this was the course of drug development that the sponsor had chosen in order to show that their drug was safe and effective. The drug's on the market, but I think it made people question: is the requirement for having a large-scale randomized phase 3 trial in all situations absolutely necessary? And the answer, I think the FDA knew the answer to this already. I'm quite confident the answer is no. And there were certainly times in oncology that they had altered development schemes, but it just wasn't necessarily a formalized process as to how they interact with the sponsor and how do we lay out those goals so that the sponsors are bringing acceptable trial designs to the FDA for review. So this was purely scientific at the time. We issued a white paper at this particular conference that laid out some of these different development strategies. What types of effect size are we seeing? When are you seeing them? What can be done differently? What types of endpoints can be used in different situations that could be reflective of clinical benefit? Things like durability of response rather than overall survival, so that you can conduct the trials a little bit faster, perhaps in smaller situations, and expedite the development of the drug while at the same time minimizing the exposure of the maximum number of patients to an ineffective control agent. At that time, I think we had an interesting paper that laid out some development scenarios and strategies, and in many ways we were sort of thinking that this would be a good way as a multi-stakeholder group to lay out some of those strategies. Perhaps we'll publish it. It will go out there for researchers in industry or academia to use, perhaps maybe as the FDA to think about as they get new products in. I suppose to cross over into the previous panel a little bit, we did see the opportunity in terms of, this was in the context leading up to the 2012 reauthorization of the user fees, and this was early on in the process, probably toward the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, where there were some other proposals that were being floated that were being considered on the Hill that frankly were proposing to lower the standards of safety and efficacy that are currently in place. And we felt that, based on some of our work and conversations, the standards were appropriate in order to promote and protect health, and that's not the issue. What perhaps was the issue is how do you get to demonstrating that standard, and that was kind of the hallmark of what became the breakthrough therapy designation. And so we saw that opportunity to talk with folks at the FDA, to talk with folks on the Hill, to bring together other advocacy organizations, academic researchers, and industry, and say, if we develop this designation, will it be used? Does the FDA feel like this is something that they would benefit from formalizing? I think they've certainly done this before. We had examples of breakthrough drugs that we used at the time as case studies. There just wasn't a formal designation then, but I think they're still regarded as breakthrough drugs. But they were good models to talk about what went right. What types of collaboration occurred between the agency and the sponsor? What types of increased communications or involvement of senior leadership? What strategies were employed to reduce the number of patients on the ineffective control? In bringing all of the stakeholders together, instead of telling folks on the Hill who had an alternative proposal, no, we don't like what you're doing, we took the approach of, well, have you considered this? I think through that process, working through legislative language is, it has its pros and cons. I think, certainly not everything in the world needs to be legislated, and maybe breakthrough falls into that category because it didn't necessarily bring a great deal of new authorities to FDA. But I think where it's been powerful is it aligned a lot of different stakeholders together. It gave FDA the opportunity to formalize a process around things that they thought were scientifically appropriate for the drugs that we're seeing now in many cases, and to establish something that they could say to sponsors, if you are seeing this really substantial effect based on your early clinical evidence, we're here for you. We want to talk to you. We want to work with you. We're going to help you along, and we're going to get it across the finish line as fast as possible. So I think it's been very powerful. It's been implemented, I think, far more than anyone originally thought. We're starting to see approvals of drugs that received the designation. The designation has been granted to nearly 100 different indications in the 3 short years that it's been around. And sure, there's challenges, because aligning, most of us all think about the clinical trials required to show safety and efficacy, but there's so many other parts to an application, things like drug quality, manufacturing standards, that if once you start to expedite one part of it, everything kind of has to move along. And I think that's been, an ongoing collaborative experience on developing some of those optimal strategies, both within industry and within the FDA. But no one's ever told me otherwise, but I think, in general, I think this has been a positive program, for all stakeholders to interact better for these promising products, and ultimately provide potentially earlier access to some of the most promising therapies.
Right, thank you. And the 3 things that I heard in both of your messages that I think the advocates need to keep in mind is that, number 1, this takes time, right? This isn't something that you can accomplish with the FDA in a matter of months or potentially even a couple of years. Number 2, you need to have data to drive the asks, the demonstrations, etc. And then number 3, what I really like is sitting down with the FDA early to identify mutual challenges, right? That's something that you had indicated, and I think that's a great cornerstone to think about a partnership with the FDA. Yeah, great. What questions do we have in the audience after hearing those incredible stories?
I was just, both of you touched on it. I'm just wondering how much influence or extra clout you got by the fact that you were able to collaborate with other groups that had similar issues. Both touched on that. In addition to the fact that you had to have data to support it, is the fact that you have kind of coalition groups or maybe groups that have similar particular patterns, whether you work with other groups that have kind of degenerative kind of characteristics to them as partners in some of this, whether that enhanced your influence in the agency.
From our perspective, I don't know if it was influenced the agency. Probably the Hill. PR is important. But I think that by the time we even started going to the Hill with any conceptual ideas, we wanted to make sure that we were doing something that, number 1, was of interest, scientifically important, and something that the agency thought would be beneficial before we even started, really talking public about doing anything. And then second was, after we had settled on some of the concepts, I think, with the agency, again, prior to moving to the Hill, we spent a fair amount of time going out to the industry and saying, if this existed, would you use it? Because if the answer was no, then we certainly could have found better other things to do. I do think that made it a little bit easier to get traction relatively quickly on the Hill, that groundwork was laid. And we tried to capitalize at a point in time in history where when these user fee cycles come around, there's a lot of things that get suggested, so sometimes if you can come up with something that's reasonable, you have a better chance of floating to the top than than other things that might be ideas that haven't lasted the test of time or something.
I think for us, I think what we've learned is an organized patient voice with a consistent message is important. And so I think, so when we go to the Hill for an ask, whether that's in support of 21st century cures or whether that was long ago in 2001 about the MD Care Act and then following years its reauthorization, what we try to do, and in the last session they talked about a concise message. We have very concise messages using the same language that's repeated. So our message is pretty consistent, whatever that is. And so we organize that, we send bullet points out to parents and say, you can tell your story, you certainly can add to this, but these are the 2 or 3 messages you need to get across. And here's the language to use. So on the Hill side, in Congress, we use very consistent messages. I think that the FDA was receptive because of the methodology behind this. We started with a policy forum and it was open. So 250 families that some had very different beliefs about what should or could or which drug might be better or worse, but they were there for this general discussion. And there were times in there where there was a little heat, at least some heated comments about, for instance, dystrophin as a surrogate or not, or does it qualify or not, or how do you measure it or not. And then again, as we developed the steering committee and the working groups, then we also developed the Community Advisory Board, which was, again, an open invitation for anybody in the community to review the documents, and they would be posted on a particular site. We guaranteed that their comments would be heard. We would review them. We wouldn't necessarily incorporate it into the document because of the rules, right? It had to be published, et cetera. So, but they would get a response that said, thanks for your comment. It does or doesn't fit into this, or we'll bring it up to the steering committee or whatever, so that they felt like they were heard. And then we hold a legislative conference every year in February, which is when this is about Hill relationships. So families, more than 150 of them come in February, and usually in our February meeting that's accompanied by an update of what have we done in the regulatory area this year. We'll be talking about the expanded benefit risk, and we'll probably convene some meetings around pulmonary outcomes or cardiac outcomes to inform our community about what we're doing. So I think it's that feedback loop that you have to have with the community and also with Congress, and just about relationships with Congress. We've known many of these people, even though they change. As offices change, we get to know them. We have relationships with them. We thank them all the time. We appreciate what they do, and we make sure they know that. Because I don't think anyone in any federal agency or on Congress is sitting around wondering what to do next. So I think that this is an appreciation of the fact that they are busy, really involved, thoughtful people, and we recognize that and try to find that messaging.
I saw one more question.
Yeah. So I often think about groups that are not as well resourced and lessons you guys have learned along the way. You're clearly doing a lot of things right. But if you are an organization with a really discrete set of resources and bandwidth, I think I'd like to hear 2 things. One, what do you think of the things you've done are the most important, right? And secondly, mistakes maybe that you've learned along the way that you see other organizations making fairly consistently that, are just money's not well spent or misdirected.
Do you want to go?
As an organization or with respect to these 2 projects?
You're just organizationally.
I think where we have tried to capitalize on, and being a pretty small organization, we've had the good fortune of being able to work with some of the world's experts in predominantly oncology, but depending on the project, other areas as well. And that spans all sectors, whether it's experts at FDA, NIH, within industry, academic advisors, other advocacy organizations. I think having subject matter experts in the field that are extremely willing to provide advice to you is huge. It gives you a sounding board. It makes sure that you are indeed trying to address the right questions and do so in the most reasonable ways forward. And I think where we've been, where we've had success in that area is, hopefully people that have been involved in our projects see that there are tangible outcomes that at least move the ball forward. And so it helps us kind of be a little bit of a bridge between, in some regards, the scientific community and the policy world, and working with scientists that otherwise may not have the venue to be involved in policy, that we can sort of provide that. And so, people aren't working with us to, gain an honorarium. We can't afford that. So we employ our volunteers. And, in terms of potential mistakes along the way, it is really, really important to try and keep everyone on the same page. And when you have these big groups, that can be hard. You definitely have to know what you know and know what you don't know and respect that. So I think Sarah mentioned in some of her remarks that the FDA is a very large organization, and an individual's opinion is different than an agency's opinion. And just because you submit a question to the agency and don't hear back later that same day, it doesn't mean you're being ignored. So you have to respect other people's processes, because for most of the causes represented in the room here, I think everyone is trying to work to the same goal. We all just sort of do it differently. So you do have to respect that.
Sure. So I think one of the most important issues that can be done with without significant resources would be to understand caregiver preferences or patient preferences, to understand how do they weigh benefit risk, what's meaningful benefit to them. I don't mean clinically meaningful benefit in terms of the doctor saying you're benefiting, good enough. I mean meaningful benefit to the patient. What would make a difference in their lives? I think it's really important to understand what the constituency believes and thinks about that. I think you could develop a survey. How ours was developed is we again gathered some of the community members as an advisory board, had them list their worries, and captured those worries in a systematic way with people who knew how to do surveys and whether experiments will work or not, and then reached out through social networking. That isn't as broad as we want to go, but it certainly gives us a flavor of caregiver preferences. So I think that's something, and then to be able to report that back. Here's what we learned. And I can't tell you the number of stories. We also collected stories as well. Please, here's what we learned. Tell us your story. So we collected in a matter of 2 weeks 200 stories. And Duchenne's a rare disease. So we felt like that was good, and patients felt like they were heard. So I think that's a very good and important way to communicate with your community and understand. I mean, we've made mistakes all along the way. In Duchenne today, there's a lot of drama. In Duchenne, I think Richard and if Steve was still here, they would smile if I said that. There's 46 foundations because social networking empowers people to have their own foundation. And so they want to do something for their son. And I think the other thing that has complicated this, to the good, it's great that we are learning this, but it's complicated because now it's about your molecular diagnosis. Soon it'll be about your biomarkers. So as we get more and more fragmented, then I want a particular medicine for my child, which means I'll have a foundation because my friends, so it gets into this. So I think for us, it's trying to find where do we agree. Pulmonary outcome measures would be really important for everybody, right? So then we try to be open and gather, but it is hard. And mistakes along the way, there have been many of them. We're 22 years old, and I think our biggest sin is we want to do everything all the time. And so there's, from care, we now have initiated a program to certify centers so that we can assure patients that they're getting optimal care. So we have 9 centers growing to 20 in 2016. And we do advocacy, we do research, we do care, we do education, and I think we have a small staff and a small budget. So we have, my mother would say, the ideas are grandiose and the budget is about a beer a day. So I think that is our sin. I think we try to just walk, guidance. Somebody says do guidance, and we're like, okay, and that's kind of how we are. So I think we are trying to be more strategic about what is it going to do, how is it going to change the landscape, how much does it cost, and who else will be contributing to the overall cost of this effort, and can we leverage additional money? That's kind of how we look at it.